Good evening and welcome to our Fulton Bible Institute class for this week. Now we appreciate you joining us. This week we are on lesson number 7, talking about the book of Daniel. We are finishing up our study of the major prophets. Beginning next week, we will study our minor prophets, and we're going to look at about 3 prophets a week. So we've got about 4 or 5 more weeks left of this class. Appreciate everyone's attention, everyone being here. I appreciate your being with us and making this class a great success. As we go through this class tonight, we will look again at Daniel. As I was going through this, I hope this brings back memories for you as it did for me, because as I was preparing for tonight, I was sort of thinking about that it wasn't just a year or two ago that we studied Daniel here at FBI. Matter of fact, it was last spring. I guess it was last spring, a year ago. We studied Daniel because you remember we had to finish it online because of the coronavirus and all that happened with that. So we'll get to go tonight and do what we did in 12 weeks in a week. And again, you know that Daniel is a very deep, very important book. But we'll look at the high points of it and study it. And hopefully this is, again, a reminder for you and to think about what we studied and what we looked at. So let's look at Daniel. As we look at Daniel, Daniel is written in 2 languages. It has a unique situation, a unique distinction of being the Bible book written in 2 different languages. It was written in Aramaic and also in Hebrew. The first chapter or so is written in Hebrew, and around chapter 2, Daniel switches to Aramaic. Now, what this does, this represents the personal history of Daniel. This represents Daniel's life as it was changed, because we see to begin Daniel's life, he was a Jew of the southern kingdom of Judah, but he was taken to Babylon in 606 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, and there he lived for the remainder of his life. And what happens is Daniel is that as he was at Babylon and as he's under the guidance of Nebuchadnezzar, he learns the Aramaic language, and not just the Aramaic language of Babylon, also the Jewish language sort of transforms to become Aramaic versus Hebrew before. And so this is what we're going to see later in the New Testament, is by New Testament times a lot of the Jews have lost the knowledge, the mastery of Hebrew, because they now speak Aramaic, not Hebrew, because of the 70-year captivity. And so what we see is that Daniel was here at the beginning of the captivity all the way to the end. You remember 606 is the year that Nebuchadnezzar marches down into Jerusalem, or into Judah, and into Jerusalem, and takes captive the nobles. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then he brings those back to his palace. And so this is when Daniel is transferred into Babylon. We notice that Daniel lived and prophesied in the heyday of Babylon and witnessed its fall to the Medes and the Persians. Daniel sees Babylon from its highs all the way to its lows, so it's the very end. And that's what the book of Daniel is going to cover. It's going to cover the idea of Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to cover the idea of Belshazzar. And then it's also going to show the reign of Darius. And we'll talk about those as we get there. And so when we look at this book, we see this book covers a period of about 606 BC to around 536 BC. Again, those are 536 is an approximate date. We're not exactly sure when Daniel died or how long he lived, but based on what we do know and what we do have, we can see some things about that. And so this is what we're looking at as we study the book of Daniel and we study what it teaches us. Daniel was born, as I said earlier, in Judah. He was born to a royal family and was among the thousands taken by Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC. So Daniel here, we talked about this last week, that Ezekiel was taken during the second captivity, or the second conquest, and he was of the priestly family. Here you have a noble family, man of the king of the palace, and this is why that Nebuchadnezzar takes him captive, because you see the second part, he takes Daniel back and some other Hebrews, and he begins to train them for special service by the king. He trains them to be his ambassadors. He trains them to be his helpers who interact with the people. And this is very important because it worked very well for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did this not just with Judah, but with every nation he captured. He would take the nobles and he would capture them and bring them into his court, and he would train them in the ways of Babylon, and then he would use them as the the higher-ups, the officials in his court. And what they would do is that Daniel would be in a unique position where that when Jews come into Nebuchadnezzar, they come to have a problem or have an issue that Nebuchadnezzar needed help them with to fix them, he would be able to have someone who would be able to speak the Jewish language, Hebrew, as well as Aramaic, and could be that intermediary between the people and Nebuchadnezzar. And this was for all people. Nebuchadnezzar had these men who would be mediaries between him and the people coming to him. Daniel was even given a Babylonian name, not just him, but also his other friends that are with him, and he's given a name to Belshazzar. And so Daniel is incorporated into Babylonian palace and into Babylonian life. Now, although he was incorporated into the Babylonian kingdom, into the palace, given a job, given an official position, he was also a deeply spiritual man. And he maintained his integrity before God under trying circumstances. Now, when we look at the book of Daniel, we'll see Daniel maintains his faith no matter what happens. And he was put in some very dire, very hard stances. Here's a few of these we'll look at. He would not eat the food which was given by King Nebuchadnezzar. And that food was either unclean or consecrated to an idol, dedicated to an idol. And Daniel refuses to eat it. Matter of fact, you remember Daniel has convinced the man over him that it's okay. And remember, he says, well, compare it. Let us eat this for a while and compare the two and see which one is better. And so we see that. Then later, Daniel spoke God's message faithfully in Daniel chapter 5 when he stands before Belshazzar, when the finger appeared and wrote on the wall of Mene, Tekel, Parezin. You remember, Daniel stands and he says what that message is. A lesser man may have been tempted to change that message. Knowing that that message prophesied doom to the king, Daniel still told what that message was. He didn't hold it back. He didn't change his message. And then we see in Daniel 6 that he prayed to God, he prayed to the Lord, in spite of a devious edict against such worship. Although men tried to put him out, although men tried to make it illegal, what he did, Daniel still went to the same window, opened that window, looked out that window, and prayed to God toward Jerusalem. And this gives us an idea, an example of the kind of man Daniel was, the kind of person Daniel was. And again, we see this, Daniel, and this goes from Daniel, he wasn't just faithful older in life or younger life, he's faithful throughout his entire life, because we see Daniel 1, as I said earlier, happened in 606. Daniel would have been probably a teenager. Most people believe Daniel would have been a teenager, somewhere probably around 15, 16, maybe even younger than that, but around that age. And when you put him at that age, when Nebuchadnezzar captures him, then you go to around 536, by the time people date the lines then, in chapter 6, Daniel's in his 80s, if not close to 90. Daniel's a very old man, but yet he still stands for his faith. He still ensures that he is being faithful, he is being true, he is being the man that he knows he needs to be and he ought to be to serve his God. And so now we look at the idea of what God does for Daniel. We're off the book of Daniel. God gave Daniel a special gift. This is one of the things that made Daniel stand out, is that Daniel was given the special gift of interpreting dreams and visions. He interprets those of other men in Daniel chapter 2 through Daniel 5. He interprets dreams and visions of different men, and he tells them what it means. Then we see that God even gave Daniel visions of his own. The second half of Daniel 7 to Daniel 12. And this is the interesting thing about the book of Daniel, is that if you look at the book of Daniel, we talked about this when we talked about the class last time, is that most of us who've grown up in church, most of us who study and try to learn God's Word and look to it and follow it, we know the first 6 chapters of Daniel. When we go through the review here in just a minute, you're going to know those first 6 chapters. However, if you don't know the last 6 chapters, it's because those are Daniel's visions, and that's what makes Daniel a major prophet, not a historical book. The first 6 chapters are all historical. They're all narrative. They would have fit in between, right before Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah in that section. After the Chronicles and the Kings. But the second part is what puts him where he is, where it puts him in the prophets, is that is all prophecy. And again, I say that to say that we know the first 6 chapters of Daniel a whole lot better than we do the second 6. Although that second half is just as important, just as valuable as that first half. So let's look at this book, or some more facts about Daniel, Daniel was highly respected for his unique power, yet he was careful never to claim credit for himself. Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 through 30, when he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the great thing about Daniel, again, to show his faithfulness, is that Daniel's in a position, he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream that no other wise man could interpret. As a matter of fact, Nebuchadnezzar ready to put them all to death because they couldn't tell him what this dream meant. And Daniel interprets it for him. But Daniel in that spot could have said, this is what your dream means, and he could take credit for it. But Daniel, being the faithful, true man of God that he is, he says, it's not me that's telling you what this dream means, but it's my God. It is the God of Israel, the God Most High, Yahweh. And so we see Daniel fulfills this vision of Nebuchadnezzar. When Daniel fulfills this vision, he gets put into this high government position. And we see this next part, that he serves a high government position for 70 years. And we're told about 3 kings he serves under in the book of Daniel. There's a fourth king, or another king of Babylon that he may have served. We're not sure. But we do know he served under these 3 kings, and that is Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, the 2 Babylonian kings, and then he served under the first Persian king of Darius. And we know that he served in 2 different kingdoms. This tells us a little bit about Daniel, in that he was a royal official for Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, but yet he was also put into this kind of position under the new kingdom. Sometimes typically they wouldn't do that, because you didn't want someone who was faithful to the old king in a position of power, because they may try to destroy your current kingdom. They may not be as for you as they were for the king before. And so this is what we see that Daniel is. This tells us, a little bit about Daniel and his personality and who he was. There are several important truths taught in this book, and these are important truths that, for the most part, apply to us today. There's 1 or 2 that doesn't, but for the most part, they still apply to us. Number 1, it taught that the exile is only temporary. Daniel was giving the hope that there's an exile coming to an end, that the nation of Judah is going to be returned. Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt. There's also the prophecy, the talk that Babylon will be overthrown. That although Babylon was the major power at that time, their reign was only for 70 more years after they conquered Jerusalem. And in 70 years they would fall, and that's what we see in the book of Daniel. They get to Belshazzar and they fall. The Medes and Persians come in. In all of this, Daniel also teaches that the Lord expects his people to be faithful to him under trying circumstances. Again, we look at Daniel. Daniel was in a foreign land and a foreign time, a young man. He could have gave up his God. He could have turned. He could have worshipped the gods of the Babylons and worshiped with the people that he was serving, but he didn't. He still remained true to his God. And not just him, we see his 3 friends who did this as well. Also, this book teaches us that the Lord is triumphant over the vain idols of the heathen and the ungodly persons who serve them, that God is the true God. God is the God over all things. And though it may not always seem that way, God is in control, and God will triumphant over those. In the long run, God will be the one who wins the victory. God will be the one who wins the battle. And so that is very key that we remember that. And then finally, we learn in the book of Daniel that the Messiah and his eternal kingdom will come in latter days. There is coming a kingdom that will be eternal, a kingdom that will be everlasting, a kingdom that will replace the current kingdom. And this was one that was prophesied, again, over 400 years, around 400 or 500 years before the time of Christ. Again, this is written before we date that date at 536. This is 500 years before Jesus came. Daniel prophesied that there was a kingdom coming. A kingdom coming, and it would come in the days of the 4th kingdom. We'll talk about that in just a second, of what that 4th kingdom was. So let's look at Daniel and his friends. Let's look at the book of Daniel. Daniel's first 6 chapters are about Daniel and his friends. We see first in Daniel chapter 1, the first 5 verses, when Nebuchadnezzar first subjugated Jerusalem in 606, he required that some of the better educated young men from the leading families be trained for government service. He comes in and he takes men captive. He takes again those well-trained, elegant men, and he brings them into his kingdom to be trained. Among these were Daniel and 3 other men from the tribe of Judah. These are the 3 men we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's always interesting to me to notice that we know Daniel by his Hebrew name, but we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by their Babylonian names rather than their Jewish names. Verses 8 through 16, we see that Daniel and his friends would not defile themselves with the king's food. They refused to eat it. Again, we talked about this earlier. Why they refused it, we don't know. There are some that think this is unclean food. It could be food that was offered to an idol, and then to eat that was to show your approval to that idol, your worship that idol. There's a couple of different things here. It could be here, but we really don't know. All we know is there's something about the food that would have defiled Daniel and his friends, and they refused to eat it, even though the king ordered them to. And so what they do, remember they tell them, they said, well, let them eat the choicest foods, give us vegetables and water, and let's see who's better after this time period. And we see that God blesses their faith in verses 17 through 21 with progress above others in similar training. Daniel and his friends not only look better, they're given better position. They're more knowledgeable. They're more equipped to serve the kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar places them in positions of power. Then chapter 2, the first 45 verses, is all about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar later on has that dream. We talked about that a few minutes ago. He has that dream that Daniel was able to interpret. He's the only one who's able to interpret. You remember the account. Nebuchadnezzar can't find anybody to interpret the dream, so he's ready to put all the wise men to death. Daniel says, well, what's happening? Why is he going to kill all the wise men? Remember, he was in that group that's going to be killed, and he has no clue why he's going to be killed. And they said, well, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he won't tell anybody what the dream was, but he expects somebody to tell him what the dream was and then interpret the dream. And Daniel says, well, let me have a few days and let me try to interpret his dream. Remember, he calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to him. They pray to God that God will reveal the answer to them. And Daniel finally says, I'm ready to go to Nebuchadnezzar. He goes before Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar about the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar dreams a dream about a statue that's similar to this picture we see here, that has a head of gold. It has an arm and chest of silver. It has a belly of bronze, thighs of bronze, and then legs of iron and feet of iron and clay mixed together. And then you remember this dream. He sees a great rock that is cut from a mountain without man's hands. This rock rolls down and it crushes this statue and it absorbs the kingdoms into itself, and it grows from a rock into a mountain, and it will be everlasting. And then you remember Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, this is the interpretation of your dream. The first head of gold you see, that is your kingdom, Babylonian. After yours will come another kingdom, the kingdom of silver. We know it to be the Medes and Persians. After that will come the kingdom of bronze, and that will be the Grecian Empire, the Greeks. And then finally we know the iron and clay is a speaking of the Romans. And he says during that fourth kingdom that the church will be established. A kingdom will come, that God will set a kingdom that will tear these other kingdoms down and will last forever. God will establish his kingdom. Again, prophetic or messianic prophecies about Jesus coming and establishing his eternal kingdom. And so Daniel gives this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Then after Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and what it means, verses 26 through 49, having attributed his ability to the Lord, Daniel secured a statement of praise to the God of Israel and was elevated to a position of prominence in Babylon's royal court. So Daniel was here again, put even higher up in a better position, because of his ability to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and interpret it. We'll go from there to chapter 3, that we see in chapter 3, the first 7 verses, that although Nebuchadnezzar praised God in chapter 2, he was not fully converted, and we'll see that even in chapter 4, that he later decides that he's going to build a golden image. Now, remember, he builds a huge golden image and requires everyone to bow down before it, to worship. He's going to play the trumpets. He's going to play the music. And when it happens, everybody's to bow down and worship this idol. Again, where Daniel is at this time, we really don't know. But this happens. He calls all the people together. They blow the trumpets, and these three Hebrew children refuse to bow down. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refuse to acknowledge the God. And you remember, that's verse 8 to 12. Then verse 13 to 30, they're given a second chance. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'll blow the music again, and you've got a chance to bow. If you don't bow, I'm throwing you in the fiery furnace. Remember, they basically tell Nebuchadnezzar, don't worry about it. Don't worry about sounding the trumpet a second time. We're not going to bow to you and to your God. And they say, if you want to throw us into the fire, throw us into the fire. And then again, this very interesting verse in chapter 3, and that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't know God's going to deliver them. And they say, whether our God deliver us or not, we know we're doing the right thing. We know we're serving our God, and we refuse to bow down to your God. They were expecting, I believe they were expecting to go in that fire furnace and perish. They were not going to survive this ordeal, but God protects them. Remember, they go into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar heats it up so hot that even the men who throw them in burn up. But they throw the 3 men in, and then when Nebuchadnezzar looks, there's not just 3 men there, there's 4 men. One looks like a son of God. And they're walking around the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar finally calls them out, and when they come out, remember, they don't smell like smoke. Their clothes are not singed. They come out looking perfect, if you will. And Nebuchadnezzar bows down and recognizes God as the true God. But again, Nebuchadnezzar's not truly or fully converted. Because in chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. He has another dream in which Daniel interprets for him. In this dream, he dreams of being brought low, of being humiliated because of his pride. And then this first 27 verses, and Daniel warns him that this is coming if you don't humble yourself. Then for about a year, Nebuchadnezzar humbles himself and doesn't really take the prideful position. But then we see later in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar comes and looks out at his kingdom. He talks about how great his kingdom is, how great his power is, what he has accomplished and what he has done. And then immediately God strikes him with his loss of sanity. He temporarily goes insane, and we don't know exactly for how long. It said several periods of time. We don't know how long that is. But he goes out in the wilderness and begins to act like a wild animal. He eats the grass, and then it says finally, about verse 34, he looks up into heaven and acknowledges who God is, that God is the God of this world, God is the God of creation. Then it says Nebuchadnezzar regains his cognitive abilities, and he worships God. And he serves God. And again, this is punishment for his pride. And this is the last we see of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible. From there, we get into Daniel chapter 5. Daniel 5 is later under the reign of Belshazzar. And in Belshazzar, you remember Belshazzar has a grand feast. The Medes and Persians are coming. They're attacking. Belshazzar is getting ready for battle. And in getting ready for battle, he has a huge feast. History records this as a major folly because the Medes and Persians basically walk into Babylon unhindered because the entire city of Babylon is drunk from this feast. And you remember that what Belshazzar does is Belshazzar has the cups and the plates brought from the temple that was ransacked by Nebuchadnezzar. They're brought into the place where they are eating and drinking. And they eat and drink on the cups. And you remember that hand appears and writes that message on the wall talking about that you have been weighed, you have been measured, and you've been found wanting. And so Daniel comes and Daniel interprets that writing on the wall. And remember that Belshazzar says that whoever can interpret this, I'll reward him with silver, I'll reward him with a robe, and I'll make him the third in the kingdom, right under him, because you see his father was still king. Belshazzar's under him. He was the second ruler, and then the third ruler would have been Daniel. But Daniel says, don't do it. I don't need it because it's worthless, because your kingdom is falling to naught. And then we see that prophecy comes fulfilled that very night when Darius the Persian, the Mede, comes in, and he conquers Babylon and kills Belshazzar. And then after Darius conquers Babylon and takes over the kingdom, the nation, he begins to rule. Under Darius' rule, Daniel's given an honor position again. Again, Daniel's in his 80s at this time. There is in chapter 6, verse 4 through 24, a plot against Daniel. It is led. This leads to his experience in the lion's den. Remember, they make a law that you can't worship, pray, or honor any god other than the king. And remember, the government officials convinced the king this is a great law because they want to worship the king. That was a typical thing they did. Whoever your ruler was, he was almost godlike. And so this is what they do. Well, the king doesn't know they're doing this to capture Daniel. And you remember the story, we talked about it earlier. Daniel still prays to God 3 times a day. He doesn't let this law hinder him because he knows what's right and he knows what's important. Darius finds out about it. Darius has no other option but to throw Daniel in the lion's den. Remember, he throws him in and he says, may your God protect you. And remember, it says Darius couldn't eat that night, couldn't enjoy the food, couldn't enjoy the company, couldn't enjoy the entertainment. He has a restless night. He wakes up the next morning, goes to the lion den to see if Daniel's still alive. And he opens the lion's den and Daniel's there. And Daniel is alive and well. And then you remember, he takes the men who accused Daniel of this evil thing and he throws them into the lion's den and says before they even hit the floor, the lions devour them. Then after this, Darius honors Daniel and his God over this event. Darius recognizes Daniel and his God for what they have accomplished and what his God has done for him. From there, we change to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7 is where the visions and the latter prophecies happen. Again, the latter part of this book drops the personal record of Daniel's life and focuses on the revelations given him about the kingdom of God. We begin in chapter 7, verses 1 through 28, the vision of the four great beasts. These four great beasts line up with the four parts of the statue Nebuchadnezzar saw. The first beast is Babylon, the second is Medes and Persians, the third is the Greeks, and the fourth is the Romans. This also refers to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. This death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah is prophesied about. Again, not in clear terms, but it's mentioned. The horrible thing of the horrible things the fourth beast did. This refers to the persecutions of the earthly church by Rome, of the early church. Excuse me. When the Romans began to persecute the early church, Daniel will prophesy about that in Daniel 7. Then we get to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel 8, verses 1 through 27, speaks of the vision of the ram and the he-goat. This focuses on the second and third empires that were reigning. That is the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire. The he-ram, or the he-goat, with a conspicuous horn, a large horn, is a reference to Alexander the Great. This is chapter 8, verse 5, and chapter 8, 21, one of the great conquerors of the Grecian Empire. And he's the one that defeats the Medes and Persians. Later on, it talks about the little horn that will grow on the he-goat as well. And this is, again, probably a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. We've talked about that before in our class when we talked about this. We're not going to spend a lot of time here talking about this prophecy, but he prophesies about a king that's going to come to power during the Greeks, right before the time of Christ. Then we get to chapter 9. Chapter 9, the entire chapter about it is about the 70 weeks. This is one of the most interesting chapters of Daniel, and it is one of the most disputed of Old Testament passages. Very hard to understand. Most people still don't have a consensus of what it really means. There's all different ideas. But these 70 weeks of the visions may be entirely symbolic of the whole period during which the Messianic work will be accomplished. There's some who think that it's symbolic. It's not literal. But what it does refer to is the work of Messiah. It will talk about some things that will happen during the Messiah's reign, during his life, that would occur in these 70 weeks. Again, these specific things are there. And again, some of these are talking about the destruction of the temple, the establishment of the church, the death of the Christ. All this have been in the early AD 0 to AD 100. But even though this idea, but the thing we need to get about 70 weeks, and again, not to get sidetracked too much, is to realize that the emphasis of all this is on the great results of the era rather than on fixing its exact opening and closing dates. We don't need to worry about when it starts, when it ends, but to realize what was accomplished, what happened, what God was able to do during this time period. Then chapter 10 through chapter 12 talks about the vision of certain events of the Maccabean era. Gets very specific about the reign of the Maccabees, the end of the Greeks, going into the Romans. Very interesting study. We talk about that again. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 talks about Daniel was told to seal up the book. It's one of the few books in the Bible where he's told to seal it up. Most of them are told don't seal it. Revelation, John's told don't seal the book up, but to let the people read it. Daniel is told to seal it up, to write it, to put his mark on it, and not to be opened until after these things come to pass, until after these events that are prophesied about are to come to pass, so that people can understand God's plan of what's happening. And then we see chapter 12, verse 5 through verse 13, that the prophecy was concluded. The prophecy is drawn to an end, and Daniel is books closed, and with it we end the major prophets. So again, we look at the book of Daniel, we see the importance of being faithful to God, trusting God for his deliverance, trusting God for his salvation, and again, being faithful to God no matter what the circumstances will be, and again, knowing God is in control. That God is in control and God will work all things out if we'll simply trust in him, obey him, and follow him as he's called us to do. Again, appreciate you joining us here tonight. Next week, we will look in our next lesson. We'll talk about the first 3 minor prophets. Like I said, we're going to spend the next 4 weeks talking about the minor prophets. We're going to talk about 3 minor prophets a week, and we'll be able to get those 3 fairly easily. So appreciate you joining us. We're near the end of our class this time, so we appreciate you joining us. Appreciate you being here. We know it's been a very odd year. We hopefully some things may change in the next quarter, but we don't know yet. We'll let you know as soon as we can, but thank you for being here with us and making this class such a great success as it is so far. But again, if you have any questions, any comments, need more information, please contact us and let us know. If not, we appreciate your attention tonight. Appreciate you joining us. We hope that you're having a God-blessed week, and we hope to see you all again next Tuesday night. Thank you.